Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I am Matthew Lucas. Now, we do post every week on a Friday, so do hit subscribe if you want to follow our continuing horticultural adventures.
Well, exactly. Guess where we are today?
We are in Stephen's greenhouse, and apologies to start with, it is, let's just say, appalling weather, so
Yes.
the sound might not be great, but bear with us.
Yes.
What are we in here for, though, Stephen?
Well, apart from sheltering from the rain, we do have a particular segment that we want to do today, and that's talking about, basically about Vireya Rhododendrons and how to grow them, but also the way you plant them or can plant them, and that is using old dead tree fern logs. So that's what we're going to do today.
Two things of interest to me. Firstly, Vireya Rhododendrons, which I find fascinating because they're kind of newish, aren't they? But we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Interesting plants. Secondly, growing things in tree fern, because I have just done that for the first time myself. And there are many things you can grow, which we will go into in terms of what else you can grow, apart from the Vireya Rhododendron we're going to look at.
So never throw away a dead tree fern, I have to say.
They have great use and value.
I have to say, though, the important thing you must remember when you are using tree fern is the best one to use is Dicksonia antarctica, the soft tree fern from Australia. It has a much more rooty, fibrous sort of trunk, and it makes it much more useful for growing most things in.
The other thing I must mention is the steam is not because we're in a fantastic sauna.
Oh, if only.
It's your cutting propagation.
Yes, my fogging machine is now pumping out some steam at us. But anyhow, it's all part of the fun.
We will make it through. But I think now we should go and have a closer look at the tree fern.
What a good idea.
Well, Stephen, the first thing obviously is if you're going to grow anything in a tree fern log,
Where do you get one from?
you need a tree fern log.
You do need a tree fern log. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I collect them. Wherever I see a dead tree fern, if somebody doesn't already have uses for it, I bring them home, I store them, I leave them dry. They'll sit there for years. It doesn't really matter how old they are, but if you keep them really damp and wet, they are inclined to slowly rot away, so you might actually lose them. So this one I have actually soaked in water over the last couple of days.
I'm going to say, surprisingly heavy. For some reason, I would have thought they would be quite light and airy.
The moisture content that's in them. So it's probably holding the best part of a 2-gallon bucket load with full of water in it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there you go. So I keep them dry, but then I wet them down before I need to use them. And today I might have been able to just leave it outside and it would have done that anyway.
So a question for our viewers who, unlike you, might not have access to poorly deceased Dicksonia, where else can you get tree fern logs? I mean, you can buy them, can't you, from garden centres?
I'm not sure about in other countries, but certainly here you can sometimes buy slabs of tree fern on which you might put a stag fern or what have you.
And I actually recently bought a hanging, we'll call it like a hanging basket, which was like a whole section of tree fern, slightly hollowed out with a wire through it. So you could hang it like a hanging basket, but in fact it was a slab of tree fern.
Yeah, well, there you go. So some of us are lucky enough to have access to these things, some won't. But anyhow, the processes are worth going into and explaining. Now, the plant we're going to use today is a Vireya Rhododendron, which I brought along here. And there's, in fact, my mother plant standing behind us, which is as tall as Matthew. So some of them can get to quite large plants. But nonetheless, could survive perfectly happily in a piece of tree fern log about 1 metre long, 3 feet long, virtually forever.
This could. Something that big.
I'm obviously not going to plant something of that dimensions into this. I'm going to start with a baby one.
But this could grow into that on a tree fern log?
Yes.
Wow.
The other good thing about them too is that if you are growing them in a tree fern log and you get them to quite a large size, the problem then is that they sometimes become top heavy and topple over. So what you do is you actually just submerge the tree fern log fractionally into the ground, so that will hold it up, and the roots of the Vireya Rhododendron will grow out into the ground anyway, so it just becomes part of the plant in a sense.
But you could also hang them up, couldn't you? You could suspend it.
Yes, and in fact, you know, I've done some suspending work with some things we'll show you here shortly, so you can. So what I would do though, if you're going to hang it up, is I'd make sure that you attached your chains and whatever you're going to hang it up with to the thing in the first place, so that it's easier then to hang up afterwards. So attach your chains at either end, and I'll show you a plant I've done that with later as well, and then you get ready to plant your plant.
Before we get into that though, let's talk more about Vireya rhododendrons, because am I right in thinking as a sort of a type of rhododendron, it's relatively newish into horticulture. What's the story?
They are. I mean, the cold climate rhododendrons, of course, have been around for decades and decades and decades and become classical garden fodder in acidic soils in most areas of the world where you can grow them. The Vireyas were certainly discovered way back. I mean, Veitch's nursery in England were selling Vireya Rhododendrons back in the 1890s and things like that. So they've been around for quite a long time, or at least a few of them had. And in fact, they were breeding them. There were hybrids that were bred back before the turn of the last century that are still lurking around in horticulture.
So what happened? Did they just fall off the dial somehow?
Well, they did. In England, particularly, where they became quite popular, of course, they had to be grown in greenhouses and conservatories. During the wars, of course, people couldn't keep their conservatories heated, so they went right off some of these sorts of plants because they couldn't look after them.
People in Britain are probably not going to be able to heat their conservatories this winter either, unfortunately.
Well, yes, exactly.
So on that point then, quick note about hardiness.
Yeah, they're not frost hardy.
No.
They will cope with quite low temperatures. It can go down to zero-ish on the Celsius scale, so about 32 Fahrenheit. They can go down to those temperatures, but most of them don't like any frost. One or two will cope with a degree or two of frost, but they're really cool conservatory plants, basically.
Right. So not a hothouse plant?
No, not really a hothouse plant. I mean, they come from areas in the world where they come from fairly high up in the mountains, but they come from tropical areas. So Philippines, Malaysia, down through the archipelago, down to Papua New Guinea and Irian Jaya, and then they go down to northern Australia in the mountains of northern Queensland, where in fact this one comes from.
So this is an Aussie?
This is an Australian species. We actually have two.
Yeah.
The first one discovered was actually discovered after Baron von Mueller, who was the first director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, had said if there was an Australian native rhododendron, that's where it will be, in the mountains of northern Queensland.
And he was right.
And he was dead right. So they discovered Rhododendron Lockie, which they named after Lady Locke, who was the governor's wife. And then this one reared its head on Mount Finnegan in northern Queensland, and for a long time was sold as the Mount Finnegan form of Rhododendron Lockie.
Yeah.
But in more recent times, they found that...
I'm noticing a different tag.
Yes, it is. It is now been named, so Australia has two native rhododendrons. So we have Lockie, which was well known and grown for a long time. We now have Rhododendron viriosum, which is this one. And it's a much more vigorous and bigger growing form than Rhododendron Lockie was.
Yep.
They're both red flowered, and the only major difference between the flowers is Lockie has a curved tube on the flower, Viriosum has a straight tube on the flower. So there you go. So we do have two.
Excellent.
So that's the plant we're going to plant into this piece of tree fern log today.
Okay, well I think we should begin.
All right. All right, so you can see this piece of tree fern log here. You can see the remnants of the old frond bases there, and you can also see the root system, because of course the tree fern log is made up mainly of roots, and that's why you can cut one down and transplant it into a garden bed, because you're just transplanting a root ball basically. And it's this wonderful fibriness of the tree fern which in fact will make a great habitat for epiphytic plants like the Vireya rhododendron. All right, the tools we'll need to do what we're going to do today. Hammer, we need a chisel, we'll need some bent pieces of wire so that we've got some wire to poke everything back in place. I like to include a little bit of slow release Osmocote, one of the pelletized fertilizers. This one's an 8 to 9 month one, so it should feed my plant for a long time. And of course the rhododendron. So they're the basic things I'm going to need to do what I need to do today. Now, certainly in Australia, you can often buy pre-prepared tree fern pots, and they're nearly always drilled from the core in the centre. Now, I've no idea why they do it that way, because the roots are going to struggle to get through that core, whereas if you start from the outside and go through the root system, the roots can then easily and quickly move around through the outside of the trunk. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cut out a section out of the middle of this trunk, and that's where I'm going to put my little rhododendron in. All right, so taking chisel in hand and going down like so, wobble it around a bit. I like to make a decent sized hole. So you've got to go down like so, and then you need to come in from the side and wobble it around a bit again. The plan being that what I'm going to try and do here is take out a whole chunk more or less intact. And there we go. Look at that. Just going to get down to the core. Right, now one thing you must remember is don't discard any of the tree fern bits that have come out of the hole. Those are going to go back into the hole, and if there's any left over then still don't discard it, because it could be useful in an orchid mix or in some other mix for some other epiphytic type plant. Alright, the next job is to, I guess, depot your rhododendron, and we will find out just how much root system is under this little plant. I haven't done a pre-test on it, so goodness knows what we'll end up with. So you take it out of the pot and you start shaking the potting mix away. This plant came out of a 6-inch pot or a 15-centimetre pot, and it's about the right size to be planting into one of these things. But don't, in fact, let the size of the plant worry you too much. I mean, as long as you can get enough soil or potting mix off the root system so that it will fit into the little hole I've made in my tree fern, then all should be well. Now, the idea is to get rid of as much potting mix as possible, because I don't want it in there potentially rotting down my tree fern stump. So there we go. There is the young plant with all of the root system that I've left on it. All right, so I've got that down to a virtually bare root system. There's more or less no potting mix left in there at all. And this is ready now to get installed into its new home. But before I do that, I'll sprinkle just a little bit of slow release fertilizer in the bottom of the hole, because that will feed it. All right, we're actually at the exciting bit now, which is actually installing our little Vireya rhododendron into its home. All right, so all we have to do is poke the root system down into the hole. And as you can see, my little hole is more than big enough to accommodate all the roots of that little rhododendron. And then we're just going to poke bits of the old tree fern fibre in and around it. So that's the next bit. So just poke them down around it, making sure that you don't leave too many gaps. There we go. Like so. And the next trick is where I use my staples. So I just poke those in on an angle like so. Give it a bit of a whacking in place. There we go. And then one on the other side so that that will hold it all there. Whoops. There we go. Voila, all done. The reason, of course, for putting down those wires, it's really just to hold everything in place. So it holds the broken up pieces of tree fern and the little tree in place so that it's not going to move.
Stephen, thank you. That was so interesting. And now I feel somewhat foolish, because the ones that I bought, of course, have been drilled out from the top.
They'll probably work, but, you know, this is the better way of doing it.
All right, now, so once you've done this, you've got your plant, I think important to remind viewers that you soaked this for how long?
It was actually sitting in the fish pond for a couple of days, because I knew, in fact, we were going to be doing this, but you probably overnight would be fine. Yeah. And then, of course, once you've potted your plant, I guess you call it potted, or you can't say you've logged it.
Installed.
So once it's in place, then water it well again to make sure that you've settled everything down in and around it. So that's really important. And then make sure that you keep it damp, because you can't overwater something in a tree fern log, because the excess moisture will just go away.
Ah, good to know.
Yeah, but you can end up with a dry tree fern log, which can then be quite hard to reinstate water. So if you're thinking that your tree fern log might be a little on the dry side, then just pick it up and submerge it in water until all the air bubbles come out, and then you know that your rhododendron has had a good drink.
Good to know, good to know. So we have this newly installed option here, but behind us, Exhibit B, is how this is going to grow and develop. And I think this is amazing. So let's show everyone.
This is going to be a little bit of a challenge here, but here I have a plant of a thing called Philesia.
Philesia.
Now, Philesia is a Chilean plant. It grows up the sides of trees and things through the moss and the bark. And I've actually seen this growing up the Fitzroy tree, which is one of Chile's incredibly old ancient conifers. And it will grow up the side of the tree, in amongst the bark and on the moss of the tree. And it flowers generally in late summer, autumn. And it's related to the Lapageria, the Chilean bellflower. And it in fact gets tubular, reddish coloured bells that will hang on it. And this plant has completely encompassed this piece of tree fern.
It has, but firstly, can we just have a moment about how beautiful it sounds with its bells of beautiful flowers? Wow.
Yes.
Anyway, so winding back, would this have been about the size of the Vireya we just planted?
It would have been just a little plant that I took out of a pot that would have been much like the Vireya.
And the same size aperture?
Yeah, you can't find the aperture anymore because it's all grown over with moss and what have you, but I would have drilled a little hole with a chisel round about the middle of it, planted this Philesia in it, and it has just gone nuts.
It loves it. So I guess this is the aim, isn't it? That the plant becomes one with the tree fern lot.
Exactly. And in fact, funnily enough, other things can happen as well. This one's actually got some baby tree ferns that have germinated from spores in the log. Now, there's things you need to know about that. It can be fun to have that happening, but you may actually have to remove some of the volunteers that come up if they get too big and too competitive with the actual plant you wanted to put in.
Yeah. And now I see you've got chains on this one, so this one hangs up?
Yeah, it hangs up in one of my shade houses. It gets watered almost nightly during the summer when the sprinklers come on to water the pots that are there, and it just revels in it. And once every year or so, I sprinkle a few pellets of slow-release fertiliser in amongst the moss, just to give it that little bit of extra something.
Wow.
And you could consider foliar feeding, all that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah. But essentially, though, it's drawing its nutrients from the tree fern as the tree fern slowly decomposes, isn't it?
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm not quite sure when I did this plant, but it has to be at least 10 to 15 years ago.
Yeah. And it still looks as healthy and happy as Larry.
It does, and it throws some lovely flowers for me every late summer, autumn.
I think I'm going to have one of these. Now, we are also in the middle of shooting a sort of a sequential film about plants of Chile, because you've got so many amazing plants, and Chile just seems to have incredible
wonderful plant material, because it's got such a diversity of climate, altitudes, the whole thing.
So we might come back and visit this when it's in bloom. Well, I think the next thing is talk about other types of plants that you could grow in this manner.
All right. Well,
it really is gorillas in the mist.
It is, isn't it? Yes.
So, $1,000,000 question, what else could you grow in tree ferns?
All right. Well, the obvious things, of course, are things like epiphytic orchids. There's many epiphytic ferns that could be grown in tree fern logs, but there's all sorts of other slightly obscure plants, and of course me and obscure.
Being you, obscure.
Yeah, definitely the way to go. And I've got one here which I thought might be of interest to people. Now you can see the little creamy bells there, and we'll get a close-up of it later.
Yeah.
This is a plant that comes from sort of southern Gippsland up into southern New South Wales, and it actually grows on the sides of tree ferns in its native habitat. And it's a thing called Fieldia australis. Now, Fieldia, it's a plant that belongs in the African violet family. So it's a Gesneriad. And it's one of Australia's very few Gesneriads.
Wow.
And it can grow right up the trunk of a tree fern from ground level and completely cover the whole trunk of the tree fern. It has running stems which will cling on as they go up, and you could certainly plant that in the same way I planted the Philesia.
What a fabulous plant. Wow, I just think I'm going to have to leave with all of these plants, Stephen. All right, what was the other thing I saw?
And the other plant that is slightly obscure and interesting that could be done in the same way is this plant here. This one's a bit big to obviously put into a tree fern stump, but it's a plant called Dermatobotrys saundersii.
Okay. And after there was a Saunders.
Yes. I'm not quite sure what Dermatobotrys stands for, but we might look it up one day. Now, this is in the same family as the Cape fuchsias, the Scrophulariaceae family. So, foxgloves, all those sorts of things. And it's a shrubby plant that grows in the forks of trees and in the moss on the sides of trees in the Southern Cape area of South Africa. And it also could be grown perfectly happily in a tree fern log.
Interesting. We should point out that it has been savagely butchered by you to propagate it for evil commerce.
Yes, exactly. But it will shoot madly from where I've cut bits off.
It already is.
Yes, it's already starting to bud up. So once the warmer weather sets in, it'll be off and away again, and then I can hack it back again.
Very, very interesting plant.
So there you go. So there's a couple of alternative suggestions that you might like to have a try at. All right, now just another slightly offbeat suggestion. This is another Chilean plant, Luzuriaga radicans, and you can see that it's got radican stems going everywhere.
Radicans means it grows along and can root.
Yeah, sort of traily sort of thing. Now, Luzuriaga I've seen growing in Chile, and it grows up the moss on the sides of the tree trunks in the forest.
So not dissimilar.
Not dissimilar, although it seems to grow in a slightly shadier habitat than the Philesia does.
Yeah.
It gets little white bell-like flowers on it in the spring, early summer.
Yeah.
They're slightly scented. And this plant is actually in a piece of tree fern log that I've just sat into a wire hanging basket because it was just a tail end piece of tree fern log. So waste not, want not.
But this looks beautiful. Really, really gorgeous.
And again, it's probably been in there 8 or 10 years. The tree fern log is still in quite reasonable condition. And if at some point I decided that I wanted to propagate this plant, I could just cut up the pieces of tree fern log with a saw, taking bits of tree fern log with root systems of it, and so I could turn it into a whole pile of plants.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. This looks fabulous. I must confess to you that I did buy one of these from Stephen.
Yeah, you've already got one.
And it's doing well in a hanging basket, not epiphytically planted. But anyway.
And
wow, well, the rain is now really coming down, but that was fantastic. I have learned so much from that, Stephen. Thank you.
Well, it's a lot of fun, and it's something that you can do that's a little different in your garden. And of course, you can hang these things around. You can use them in places that you wouldn't necessarily use otherwise.
Yeah. And I don't know, I'm just very inspired about the things I'm going to grow in tree fern logs. So, excellent.
Just don't you go home and kill a tree fern on purpose just so you can get its log.
No tree ferns died to make this program.
Yes.
They all just fell.
Yeah.
Well, how could we possibly top this, Stephen?
Well, hopefully in a warmer, sunnier clime, we'll do something else next week.
Oh, I'm yearning for summer. But if you want to know what we're doing next week, do hit subscribe. We post every Friday with continuing horticultural adventures. So until then, take care. We'll see you next week.
Bye all.